I'm sure our viewers would like your prediction as to whether they're going to have a better life in 2023. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, when the nature of power changes and when it becomes more diffuse and more penetrative, as it is right now, it is that much more difficult to escape from it as well. So in our day-to-day lives, we're certainly more accessible, right? So if power wants to operate on us, it can do so through our Alexas, through our Google Cloud, through the iPhone, through the various technological devices that we are using on a daily basis, and which make us more exposed to nefarious forms of power if that agent wants to. Okay, so certainly being an agent of our own fate is rather more difficult within a constellation like this, right? And it starts by going outside and being on CCTV everywhere. So you are certainly being watched, and there is then that element of a contraction of freedom, if you like, in the way that we used to define freedom as also the freedom of privacy, right? The freedom to be left alone. This is very important, and it's one of the subjects of a forthcoming book that I've tried to kind of pen together with these new forms of artificial intelligence. So the idea here is that these forms of power are more intrusive, and they contract the space for truly free, uninhibited expression of whatever form of expression it is, right? But at the same time, and that's a conceptual, almost scientific law that comes from various forms of scholarship, where there's power, there's always also resistance. I mean, this is the famous phrase of Michel Foucault, the French philosopher of the 20th century, right? So when power changes, resistance to it changes as well. So we are experiencing different forms of resistance, whether it's online hacktivism, for instance, or other forms of resistance that are implicated in these new forms of power, and at the same time changing with it. So where there's power, there is always resistance. So there is always the hope to express one's subjectivity or one's agency to, escape the shackles of technology, for sure.
In summary, you think that 2023 will be a world in which more people are more controlled than ever before? Is that correct?
I think the effort to be more controlled will be there. And I think that technology gives the state, tech companies, businesses, the ability to do so. So for sure, this will continue. It's a trend that is pre-existent, but it will continue. This is the so-called Industrial Revolution 4.0, and 2023 will be another major year in that direction. But at the same time, humanity has shown in the past and present that it wants to be free, right? We want to be free. We don't want to be controlled. We don't want to be securitized. We don't want to be objects of ideology or whatever it is. And so at the same time, where this trend is going to continue, the various forms of resistance will adapt to that and continue as well.
Dr. Deepa, you're not just a trade union leading figure, but an academic. Listening to that, should we be afraid or be very afraid?
I would say be very afraid, because on the one hand, there are people like Assange, for example, who are allowing the public interest to surface through bringing together very good people and creating a rebalancing of the power of the state, where instead of the state constantly surveilling us, WikiLeaks allowed us to surveil the state. And there will be people like this who, because, as the professor said, there is an opposition to this kind of super control, there will be people who stand up. But I think we have to recognize the magnitude of the kind of power on the other side. I mean, we are in a situation where we have a government which has written off £8 billion worth of PPE on the bill of the NHS out of, I believe, 12 billion that was spent. And it has done this at a time when it is unwilling to feed children in primary schools. And rich people are getting richer, they're getting more powerful, but it also offers a brilliant opportunity for the modern equivalent of the guillotine, because when power becomes so uncontrollable and so rampant and so unmoderated, people have very little to lose. And that's something that powerful people have understood in the past, but are less willing to understand at the moment.
Nigel West, we grew up in a period where power was quite predictable. There were two blocks. A balance was kept, sometimes miraculously, between them. There was no world war. There were local proxy wars and so on. We've just heard from the professor about how diffuse power is now, and how never mind the dual power that used to exist, that's gone. But the unipower, a unipolar world, which lasted, we can now see, no more than 15 years, has also now gone. We have a multipolar. Poses a problem for a writer like you, apart from anything else.
Not at all. I'm in my element, because this is rewriting history. And as we are living here today, we're seeing history change. Let me remind you, the Soviet Union ceased to exist in 3 days. The Arab Spring started when one man was extorted in a market in Tunisia. It is really incredible what has happened around the globe. It's people power. It's why Vladimir Putin is so worried about crowds on the street and demonstrators. I gave lunch a few days ago to a girl who's left Russia, and she spent her entire life in Russia, and she said the big thing that she sees here in London, she says, why are there no police on the tube? On every platform in Moscow, there are police. On every street corner, there are police. Putin is terrified of demonstration. And if we see demonstrations perhaps in Moscow, then the world will change yet again. And we'll look back on this period as a period of dramatic change.
Well,
power or no power, power to the people.
I give you the floor to state your prediction of what will happen to Vladimir Putin in 2023, just so I can cut it out and keep it and play it back to you next year. Go ahead.
I think that the loss of Vladimir Putin in this tragic helicopter accident will be celebrated around the world, particularly by the people who he has subjected to terrible deprivation in the Ukraine and in his own country. He has been disastrous. I was a supporter of Vladimir Putin when he first came to power, because I had friends in the KGB. It may sound odd to you, but I had 2 KGB co-authors. I wrote books with them. And these were people who had traveled abroad and they knew the truth. And Vladimir Putin was one of those people who admittedly had only got as far as the GDR, but he was part of an elite within the First Chief Directorate. And what frightened him more than anything else was when he called for help, when the GDR was collapsing. He called the 1st Guards Tank Regiment in Dresden, and the commander said, I'm not prepared to move my troops until I've got permission from Moscow, and Moscow is not answering the telephone.
Yes, well, I must read that book. The world situation you summarized in the beginning as filled with hope, although I've got to tell you the president of Peru has now been overthrown in a coup. So what goes up can come down. But notwithstanding, and Cristina Kirchner, the vice president of Argentina, has now been sent to prison for 6 years.
But the left is still in power in Cuba and Venezuela.
Well, that will always be so, God willing. But the pink tide, I like to call it, rather than a red tide in Latin America, is changeable, like all tides. It comes in and goes out. How optimistic are you for the next year? It sounds like you think the wind is at your sails.
Well, we're in the middle of a winter of discontent. You've got Tory newspapers calling it a general strike, not seen since the 1920s. And so that bodes well for what the good professor described as resistance, the resistance against massive power, monopolized power, the greedy helping themselves off the backs of misery, as Nigel has, from the right of the political spectrum, denounced. You know, this isn't just a left-right thing. And I think you've said on previous shows that there's been a realignment in terms of what is left
What's
and
left, what's right.
what is right. And we in the liberation movement will continue to fight with our allies. We're cross-party, so we're not saying we're just the usual crowd in the Labour Party or the peaceniks. This is all people who want to be liberated from Big Brother, Big Sister, you know, the monopoly power that oppresses us by spying on us, by affecting our ability to talk to each other in a democracy. You've seen these draconian laws that have been brought in by the government to clamp down on protest, to clamp down on democracy, and the fact that we don't have a free press in Britain.
Nigel, you and I are so old we write books. Nowadays, it's all the other kinds of power that the professor was talking about. And it's true that a huge chunk of our people have migrated from the literary world into the virtual world, where we discover that what we thought was a public square was in fact being ruthlessly policed by big tech in alliance with the security state, particularly in the United States. Does that keep you awake at night or give you any qualms at all?
I must admit that I hadn't really appreciated or believed in the deep state until I saw the politicization of the FBI. 6 individuals at the top of the FBI being very political, independent as they should, and as the Bureau has always been in the almost always been in the past. I found that very worrying, and that is something that we're going to have to guard against in the future.
Well, we had 51 senior intelligence figures putting their names and their faces to a claim that the Hunter Biden laptop story was Russian disinformation. We now know that every word of it was true.
We also now know, thanks to Chris Steele's fabrication, that the so-called Trump dossier was also completely bogus.
It was...
and it was reported by CNN. It was reported by CNN, by BBC, to the extent that some of those correspondents claimed that they had security sources that had confirmed some aspects of the material from leaks from within the National Security Agency. I mean, that, I'm afraid, is just sheer nonsense. They haven't apologized, though. They fabricated, they made up stories. None of it was true. And as a result of that, Chris Steele, his fabrications have now been exposed, but he's still out there producing yet more bogus reports.
But were the Russians involved in putting Trump in power? Did they get involved in a dirty campaign?
There is no doubt.
Discredit the opposition?
There is no doubt that the Russians campaigned covertly, both for Trump and, bizarrely, for Hillary. I mean, that is what is so extraordinary. But I've never met anybody who said, yes, because of one particular Twitter feed, that influenced my vote and I changed my vote as a result. I don't know, is the answer.
Dr. Driver, what we've seen, Elon Musk, a billionaire, paid $44 billion for a $10 billion company, but he's opened the books at Twitter, and what is revealed is very troubling indeed, isn't it?
I think it is. I think it is not astonishing to those who've been saying it for a while that much of the journalistic establishment in this country is repeating either intelligence lies or carefully planted political lies and presenting it as fact. And it's really important that people understand that this is why organizations like WikiLeaks, which published the facts, were important. Because now, with WikiLeaks documentation, for example, you can look back at unredacted data from which has been declassified and understand how the world really evolved. But the Twitter saga tells you how conversations are manipulated by very rich, very powerful people in order to achieve ends that they want to achieve, whether it is in COVID, in misleading people about the scale, the effect of the pandemic, the restrictions that need to be in place, the timeliness of the restrictions, what kind of protections you need to take into it, or on other things. So the truth is more important than ever before if we want justice and equality.
But they don't get much richer than Elon Musk, and he's the one who's now exposing all these lies and falsehoods. So thank goodness for some rich and powerful men. There's no time left for me to soliloquize. I just say that 2022 for me was the year in which the liberals were unmasked as the tyrants and authoritarians, and the conservatives who turned out to be the believers in liberty. Who would have thunk it? I wish you all, however unlikely, a Happy New Year.